All right, it's 2:30, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. A little bit about me. My name is Ashley Atkinson. I'm a junior at Michigan State University, and I'm majoring in genetics and nutritional sciences. I currently work as a chemistry undergraduate learning assistant, or ULA, and it's my dream to become a genetic counselor, someone who advocates for and educates people in their care when it comes to genetic testing in similar situations. I wanted to tell you all a little bit about how I got started with educating. I was in a pretty dark point in my life, spring semester of my freshman year. I was depressed, I had really bad anxiety, and I didn't really have anything I was passionate about in life. And that changed for me when I was offered a learning assistant position for a general chemistry lab. I wasn't really sure about the position. I wasn't super passionate about chemistry lab, and I was currently stuck in my routine of talking to no one. So reluctantly, I accepted the position because I wanted to have something to show for my time at MSU, and I had done well in the class. Now I can confidently say that being a UNLA has changed my life. While I began my teaching journey hesitant and nervous, teaching my students is a huge passion of mine. I've moved on to general chemistry lecture, so I get more one-on-one time with my students, and I'm loving it. So this is kind of what brings me to SciFest. I've always had an interest in genetics and nutrition, but now I know that my favorite parts of both those fields is teaching them. To hit the sweet spot between my interests, I've chosen genetically modified organisms to present on today, as they're extremely relevant in all of our lives. So what even are genetically modified organisms? Believe it or not, unless you're going out of your way to buy only organically, all of us are eating GMOs. This is why it's important that we understand what's going on here, because GMOs are consumed by you, your friends, your family, people all around the world. While I won't encourage you to buy one way or another, my ultimate goal is to educate you all so that you can make informed decisions about what you're buying for yourself and others. All right. So we're going to start with a quick activity. And I would like everyone to answer what they think GMOs are. I'm not really worried about accuracy here. I just want to see what conceptions we're coming in with. So you can scan this QR code with your phone, or you can go to the website on the slide and use the password #SciFest. And I'm going to set a timer for 2.5 minutes so that we have some time to get some answers in. Okay, we have an answer. Yeah, that's really good. I would agree with that for sure. Excited to see what else people say. Right, yeah, we have another comment. I usually think of food or plants that have been changed for a specific reason. Definitely, yeah. So we're kind of going towards this idea of altering things for our own desires. We'll give it about another minute and a half. Awesome. So we have a third answer. Okay, usually have a negative connotation in terms of health. We can definitely talk about that for sure. Give it just around 20 more seconds. See if we can get another response. All right, 3 answers. I will definitely take that. Great job on that. So let's move on to the next slide. So let's start with some history. Humans have actually been genetically manipulating organisms, particularly plants, for thousands of years. Even the earliest farmers knew that they could use seeds from better plants for better offspring. People selected for desirable traits just like we do now. These included plants that produced greater yields, better tasting plants, bigger plants, and plants that were more resistant to the elements of nature, like weather. For example, this first picture we have here compares teosinte and modern day corn. Teosinte is considered to be the parent plant of modern day corn, meaning that corn gradually evolved from teosinte. This process happened by humans selecting for desirable qualities, just like the ones we see in corn. This process is thought to have taken around 7,000 years. The second picture we see here is wild corn versus modern carrots. Orange carrots began to appear from selection around 1700s. The orange one looks a lot more appetizing, right? Just shows how powerful simple selection can be given enough time. Here's a figure of how different plants evolved from wild mustard. We can see that as humans selected for certain traits such as stems, leaves, and flower clusters, and over thousands of years, we got the differentiation between cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, and cauliflower. So that's super interesting. Moving on to a more formal definition, dictionary.com defines a genetically modified organism as an organism or microorganism whose genetic material has been altered by means of genetic engineering. This is also known as genetic modification, meaning GMOs have had their genomes purposely altered, just like we saw with some of those responses. To break that down into layman's terms, GMOs are living beings that have had their genetic code tweaked in some way. Usually, when we talk about GMOs, we mean that something has been changed by more than just selecting for certain qualities over time. We mean that a gene has been changed or inserted or deleted in a lab. This definition also includes more than just plants. Genetically modified bacteria are a thing too. Moving on to how GMOs are created, well, the first step requires moving some DNA into a plant cell. One method of doing this is to coat some tiny pieces of metal in the DNA we want to insert into the plant cell. So surrounding this little metal particle with DNA, then we shoot these tiny pieces of metal at the plant cell. This allows the DNA to go inside the cell. Another method is to use a bacterium or virus. Many viruses and bacteria transfer DNA to a host cell as a normal part of their life cycle. So the bacteria or virus transfers the new DNA to the genome of the plant cells, and then these plant cells make more cells, some which include the newly transferred DNA. A similar process happens with the particle method as well. Fun fact, the sweet potato contains DNA sequences that were transferred thousands of years ago. A bacteria must have transferred a gene that made the sweet potatoes survive better or longer, allowing them to be present today. There are other ways to change the genomes of crops, such as mutational breeding or genome editing, but today we'll be focusing on GMOs that use this technology. So I wanted to walk us through an example of GMOs in our everyday life. Okanagan Specialty Fruits, a biotechnology company located in Canada, has invented a product they called Arctic apples. When Okanagan made these apples, their goal was to genetically modify golden delicious apples to reduce browning. Their goal was to accomplish this by slowing the process of apples browning. This is called enzymatic browning, and this happens through something called an oxidation reaction. And this enzymatic browning happens in a lot of fruits and vegetables. I'm sure you can name a few, like apples, vegetables. The enzyme that causes this reaction is called polyphenol oxidase, or PPO. The big thing about Arctic apples is that they completely lack this PPO. So how did scientists even accomplish that? I mean, that's wild, right? Removing a protein from an apple and having it disappear forever for the rest of its genetic offspring. Well, in order to move this enzyme, RNA interference, or RNAi, is used to prevent PPO from being produced. RNAi is a natural biological process that has the ability to recognize and delete specific RNA structures. To apply this to Arctic apples, scientists introduced RNA sequences that aim to delete PPO in the target apples. Scientists tested this idea on golden delicious apple buds, inserting a transgene, which is an engineered piece of genetic material. Those apple buds were planted, and one of those trees produced what is now known as Arctic apples. So here's a diagram so we can visualize what I just said a little better. On the left, we can see a cross-section of an uncut apple. In both the regular apple and Arctic apple, there is no oxygen, so no browning occurs. On the right, when both apples were cut, we can see that the regular apple starts to brown. With oxygen, that browning reaction can occur. However, because there is no PPO in the Arctic apple, no browning occurs there. So that's nice and all, but how do we know that these are safe for eating? For one, this is USDA approved, so it's good to know that the US Department of Agriculture is on board with this. It was also found in trials that Arctic apples do not have the power to take over normal apples in terms of population, so it's safe to grow these trees next to each other without any issues occurring. In addition, this isn't a superfood in any way, so it's still affected by regular pests just like regular apples. One common rebuttal is that there could be unknown effects from not well understood mechanisms. While that's an important point to bring up, no effects have been seen over long-term studies lasting multiple years. So because no one has had any side effects from these Arctic apples and they're safe for the environment, these are actually available on the market for purchase. So one question I wanted to ask the audience is, would you eat an Arctic apple yourself? And I want you to give your honest opinion here. It's okay if you don't think it agrees with mine. So we're gonna do another poll, and here is that information. So same kind of system as before, and I'll give this one around a minute and a half. We have 2 votes so far. Gonna give it another 30 seconds or so to see if we can get another. Okay, so we have 2 votes for yes and 1 for maybe. It's very interesting to see that. Very exciting. So let's move on. So why do we use GMOs besides for taste and convenience? Well, other common reasons are that genetically modifying an organism can protect them from insects, weeds, and the weather. This is great because oftentimes plants aren't able to be harvested due to the natural elements. So the more harvest, the more yield, which means more food and more money. Some secondary benefits are that they tend to be cheaper because they don't require as much upkeep, they cause less soil erosion, and they also require less pesticide application, which means less dangerous chemicals in the environment. Other applications of GMOs are seen in medicine and vaccines. For example, there is currently a COVID-19 vaccine in production that is plant-based called CoVLP. So that's really interesting and relevant to what's happening right now in the world. So speaking of these pesticides, how do GMOs affect insects? Well, we have to remember here that our goal is to ultimately make it so pests have zero impact on these plants. Pesticides accomplish this by adding chemicals that are poisonous to bugs, and unfortunately, this also kills beneficial organisms such as butterflies and bumblebees. GMOs, on the other hand, have a protein that is toxic to pests, so a more natural way of poisoning these bad pests and not the beneficial ones. So that's something that's important to keep in mind when considering whether or not to support GMOs. So now onto the big question that I'm sure everyone's wondered at one point, are genetically modified organisms harmful to your health? Thankfully, right off the bat, I can say that there's no data that indicates that consuming approved GMOs is harmful. How do we know? GMOs have undergone more detailed evaluation than any other groups of plants that we consume. In almost all cases, GMOs differ from their normal plant by the addition of just 1 or 2 genes that produce 1 or 2 new proteins. The origin and function of these proteins are well understood. For example, the proteins are studied to make sure they do not have any characteristics that are likely to cause allergic reactions. It's also important to note that GMOs do not have any particular health benefits either, meaning our body treats them just like normal foods. In addition, over the 2 decades that GMOs have been on the market, there have been no occurrences of health issues due to genetically modified organisms. So how are GMOs regulated? We talked about their detailed evaluation a little bit, but we can say a little more here. In the US, the regulation of GMOs is divided among three regulatory agencies. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, regulates biopesticides and actually all pesticides in general. The FDA oversees the safety and proper labeling of all plant-derived food and feed, including those from genetically engineered products, so they protect both us and animals. Finally, the U.S. Department of Agriculture protects animal agriculture from pests and diseases, meaning that they make sure that any GMO released won't put any livestock in danger. So we have a couple different agencies making sure that what's on the market is safe for us. I have one last interactive slide. Now the prompt is, how would you describe GMOs to a friend? This one is similar to the first one, so let's see how these responses have changed. And hopefully we'll be able to see these responses on my screen together. Here's the info. I'm going to give this one around 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. We'll see. Awesome. We have 2 answers so far. Really good. Give it another minute or so. Awesome. I'm really happy with the answers we're getting. We'll see if anyone wants to chime in. A couple more seconds. All right, super great job, guys. We have some really good, another one, really good communicators in the crowd. Yeah, this is awesome. Thanks for participating. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Let's weigh the pros and cons so we can make informed decisions about what we're buying for ourselves and families. On the pro side, we talked about how GMOs have never been proven unsafe. In addition to this, we talked about how GMOs lead to a greater yield, which lowers prices and increases nutritional content. And this is really important as we have a growing population in the world and we're talking about how to get this food distributed to everyone in the world. And then growing GMOs leads to environmental benefits as well, as they negate some use of pesticides. On the con side, we also don't have a ton of super long-term data to support GMOs. They're relatively new and that can be a little bit scary. Also, GMOs could potentially introduce a new protein that causes an allergic reaction, which could be dangerous if consumed. Finally, because GMOs are resistant to pesticides, it's easy to use a lot of pesticide without killing them. For example, if you have regular plants growing amongst GMO plants and you still want to make sure those plants are protected, you could use a lot more pesticide. If this happens, GMOs could lead to an overall increase in the use of pesticides. I know I just talked about how GMOs can reduce the use of pesticides, so it really comes down to how we decide to use them. Hopefully, those who choose to grow GMOs are educated on how to treat them. Okay, so ultimately, the decision to seek out GMOs or avoid them is yours. My main goal was to inform you all about GMOs and talk about some real life examples so that you can do what's best for you and your families. I trust that you all will make evidence-informed decisions, and I hope you learned something today. Thank you so much for listening.